Hi, and welcome to Far From Home with me, Mabel Nine, your host. Our guest today is Sherene Joseph. Sherene and I met through the Redbud Writers
Mhm.
Guild, and I was so excited to get to know her through her writings mainly because I felt like she was talking about things and writing about things that were so close to my heart. We're both immigrants from India, so that's the another common thing we share, and I'm so happy to have her here on the podcast with us. Welcome, Shireen.
Hi, Mabel. Thank you for having me.
So, a little bit about Shireen. She writes about the intersection of faith, culture, and community. She's a third culture kid by way of India, Oman, and the United States, and has lived most of her life as an immigrant Indian. A graduate of Dallas Theological Seminary, she loves long conversations over good coffee, murder mystery books, and British TV shows. Her greatest joy is sharing with others how Jesus has been her constant through life's challenges in the immigrant experience. And while her identity is firstly a Christ follower, she also lives her life fully as an Indian American. I love that. I feel like that last sentence I can apply to myself.
Mhm.
So let's start with your with the basics of your immigrant journey. You know, what took you from India to Oman and then Oman to the US?
Yeah, I think moving from India to Oman was really a decision that my parents made, because my dad moved there I think he moved in 1983. So this was back in the day when a lot of people from India were going to the Middle East or to the Gulf, as they would call it, the Arabian Gulf, for just better opportunities financially, because they wanted to make a little bit more income to support their families. And my dad worked in marketing and he got a job and he moved there and he was there for between 3 to 6 months alone, because back in the day, they only gave the work permit for one person in the family. And so he was there for about 6 months, and it was really hard for him to be away from my mother and me and the rest of his family as well. And so when he came back after the first 6 months, he brought back all of his things because he didn't want to go back. But luckily, the company gave him a family visa, and so he was able to take my mother and me back. So my fifth birthday was in Oman. And so yeah, we stayed there. I stayed there from the age of 5 till I completed 12th grade high school. And my parents continued to stay there till 2012, and in 2012 they moved back to India. And so I grew up there in the immigrant Indian community in the Middle East. And that was most of my formative experience of being a little girl, being a teenager in the Indian church and in the non-Christian circles. And our son was actually born there. So after getting married, and when I was expecting our son, my mom worked in a hospital there. And so she wanted me to come and have the baby there. So I have a little bit of time in Oman, after the time that he was born. We were there. I was there for about maybe 4 months, and yeah. And once they moved back in 2012, that was the end of our the Middle Eastern part of my life kind of came to an end. So I want to take our kids back to Oman at some point to show them, where I grew up, and because it's changed so much, but we haven't managed to do that as yet. Hopefully soon.
Yeah, I mean, even I sometimes want to take my son back to the places where I lived and all that
Hmm.
because it just seems like a far away place, even in our minds, right? And
Hmm.
unlike people who are not immigrants, who can their kids understand, oh, this is the same culture my mom grew up in, but
Yeah.
it's slightly different for us.
Yeah.
But before we go into the parenting aspect of it, I just wanted to ask you, so how did you what took you to the US? Was it after you got married?
Hmm. Yeah. So moving to the US was 3 years after getting married, I think. And it was again for work. You know, my husband worked in a company which had an opportunity here in the US. And so his team asked him to come here for a short time. So he came for 1 month, and then the 1 month was extended to 3 months, where they said you could bring, you know, your family, because very young, you know, like our son was under 2. And then the 3 months became 6 months, and then 6 months became a year. And now fast forward, it's 20 years plus. And so it was for work again. And so we moved to Michigan. That was where we started our US journey. And then Texas came calling in 2006. And once we moved to Texas, we never moved out. So Dallas became home, you know, and so that's where we've been since 2006. So yeah, so it was all for work, actually. Yeah.
Okay.
And we didn't really make the decision to, it wasn't a conscious choice about staying here. It was like 1 year at a time. My husband always wanted to go back, you know, because he was very rooted to India and to his extended family and, you know, his parents. And he always thought we would go back. I, obviously, being a child who grew up in the Middle East, I did not really have the same ties to India that he had. You know, he always calls himself the son of the soil, you know, so he had more of a like a traditional upbringing, which is comparable to those who are born and raised here in the US. You know, like you grow up in one town, you go to your grandparents' house for Christmas, or, you know, you do events and then you come back. So it's very connected to one place. Whereas I was always a little bit of a transplant, because grew up in the Middle East, went to India for summer, went for Christmas, came back, you know. So he always wanted to go back, but somewhere along the line, I think we unconsciously made the choice that maybe this is where we're supposed to be. You know, we had our kids and we were raising the children here, and so this has kind of become a temporary home for now. So we'll see where life takes us.
I forgot to ask you at the beginning a question that I ask a lot of my immigrant friends is, share a favorite memory from your childhood, whether it is India or Oman.
Yeah, I think for Oman, I actually I shared this with my kids when they were in school and doing a traditions book in elementary school. When I was growing up in Oman, for Christmas service, our service used to be at 11:30 in the night. You know, we would do the watch night service in Indian church. And so everybody would go to church by 11 o'clock, you know, so the service would kind of end by 1 o'clock, 1 to 1:15. And then because most of us didn't eat a very big dinner, because you were going to be awake for the most of the service. And at the end of the service, they'll always offer you a cup of tea and a slice of cake, you know, which is very traditional to Indian churches. But on the drive back home, my father and my mom and all of their friends, there was this little convenience store attached to a gas station on the drive back home. And he was this Malayali guy, you know, from the state of Kerala. And he would keep his store open, you know, because he was a Christian, you know, and he would keep his store open, but he would make hamburgers, you know, and we would stop at that gas station, and all the adults would get out and have tea and burgers, and all the kids, you know, we would get these hot and spicy burgers, which we'd sit on top of the car, you know, on the trunk of the car, or in the front of the car, and we'd eat them. And that was it's just a memory which stayed in my head, because I must have been so young then, you know, like 8, 10, 11 years old. But it was just what we did together as a group of friends. And in the similar fashion in India, where I've done very few Christmases in India, I've not done that many of them. But my older cousin brothers would always take all the younger cousins to a vegetarian place after the Christmas service, which was open, and get us all milkshakes and ice cream. You know, so the parents wouldn't go, but the older brothers would take a car and, you know, take all the younger cousins, and we'd have the milkshakes and ice cream, and then they'd come and drop us off, you know, at home. So it was always a fun thing that we did after the Christmas service. And so somehow that's just stayed in my head for all of these years.
Yeah, happy memories, good times.
Yeah, yeah.
um, and that's one thing that when I first came to the US, I found it strange that many churches here do not have a service on Christmas Day
Yes,
or Christmas Eve, and so I was like, what do I do with myself?
exactly. Yeah,
Because traditionally, it's either Christmas Eve, we don't celebrate it at home, just with
yeah,
family, opening gifts. That was a foreign concept to me. But we are in church, or on Christmas Day, there is a service. And
yeah,
that's where we meet everyone and all the relatives and everybody
yeah,
in church. That's the time
exactly. Yeah,
you meet, and
exactly.
it's just food and the whole day just passes by. You don't even know
Mm-hmm.
how.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. Yeah,
go
it's
ahead. So,
very interesting. Yeah, I mean, it was extremely mm, weird for us, and because for the longest time in the US, we were part of an Indian church, and so we've tried the Christmas Eve services, but our Indian church always did a Christmas Day service. So we would be there by 9:30 in the morning. We'd have a service, we'd sing the Christmas carols, and then we'd have this huge feast. Like a community meal, and everybody would go back home around 2 o'clock and crash
yeah,
because we're all so
yeah.
tired. And then in the evening, everyone would get together in somebody's house. So
Yeah,
we'd bring like whatever the leftovers, or you made something. So you made a idli or a dosa, or you bring the batter, or you bring the leftover chapatis, the chicken curry, or
yeah.
something. And then you would get together, you'd have this big meal, you'd play Pictionary or or charades, and we'd finally end the day around midnight or 1 a.m. And
Yeah.
so that's how it always used to be. Even growing up, we had either a Christmas Eve service or a Christmas Day service. And then we'd come home and exchange snacks and cake and this and that. And there was always a meal at the end of the day with a group.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
being an immigrant, it was always with extended friends who became our family.
Yeah.
It was never just family that was biological, DNA, and it was
Yeah.
always open to everybody.
Yeah.
And so the whole concept of opening gifts on like on Christmas Day, we didn't get gifts.
Yeah, me
we
too.
didn't we didn't do Christmas gifts. There was no
Yeah, I
concept
totally get
of
that.
gifts. Yeah, and our children are all about the gifts.
Yeah.
So there was no concept of gifts. So it's very, yeah, all these things change as you kind of move and you make new
Yeah.
traditions.
And we've actually missed that so much that this last year we started doing that on Christmas
Hmm.
Day, we host our Indian
Hmm.
friends and we invite them over here.
Yeah,
Whoever's, like us, missing family and
yeah,
friends and their churches. So we hope to continue, make it a tradition every year that friends can come over
yeah,
on Christmas Day. So anyway,
yeah.
talking about differences in culture, when you first arrived in the US, was it difficult to adjust to the different
Hmm.
ways of American life? And I mostly, when I look at my journey, I've been here 15 years. I've seen it in different phases. In the beginning, it was difficult, and then certain things get easier, certain things
Hmm.
never get easier. So I'm curious, what has your experience been? And maybe, this could be eye-opening to some people who don't have immigrant friends or who don't know
Hmm.
what they go through. Because on the surface, some of us seem like very well adjusted, but I'm
Hmm.
sure there are struggles and there are some parts of culture that we uh, we unlearn some Indian mannerisms and we learn
Yeah.
American ways. So, can you give us some examples of things that were a struggle for you?
Yeah, so like I said, we moved 2000 uh, to 2004, and we moved to Michigan, and I landed up in Michigan in October. So within like 2 to 3 weeks of being there, I experienced the first snow, and the whole concept of moving from Chennai, which is hot and tropical, to traveling, in jeans and sweaters, and learning to get used to wearing socks and shoes itself was an interesting thing in the first year of life like in a cold state, because I didn't spend that much of my life wearing socks and shoes. But if you live in Michigan, you wear footwear which keeps your feet warm for the majority of, at least for 6 months of a year. And so just every single thing going to the grocery store was extremely nerve-wracking and overwhelming. I've never been in such huge grocery stores, even in the Middle East. Now the Middle East has big hypermarkets, so things have changed. But even back when I was growing up, they were still small stores. So the stores are really big. Coming from India, which has a lot of the colonial terminology and all of the remnants of the colonial rule, a lot of the verbiage in the US is different. So I still remember asking my husband within a week of landing in the US to go to the grocery store, or to Meyer, it was Meyer, and I said, can you bring back a few packets of biscuits?
Oh,
Because
yeah.
our son was only, he was under 2 and he wanted biscuits. And my husband came back with 4 cans of Pillsbury, the
Yeah.
biscuits. And I was like, what is this? I've never seen this. And he said, this is what the guy told me when I asked him for biscuits. And I realized, okay, so biscuits in the US really, it means bread, which you bake in the oven. And if you want cookies,
Cookies.
which is what biscuits, so
Yeah.
I had to learn the terms,
Same thing with pickles,
gas,
right?
yeah, pickles,
Pickle.
gas and fuel, and
Yeah.
like the trunk of a car. And so the verbiage started to change, and the first time I filled my car with gas, which was almost, I think, a year after we moved to the US, because in India, we don't normally fill our cars with gas. You go and park, there's somebody who does it for you. I was very proud of myself. The first time of course, I had to learn to drive and everything. And the first time I filled my car with gas. So there were so many cultural things which I think in the United States people take for granted, because it's such a big country, and a lot of the people aren't aware of the bigger world that exists outside of the US. I think some people are, but not all of them. And so there was just a lot of things that I had to learn to adjust and kind of get used to. And, I think one thing that we have become a little more Western in the way that we wear shoes inside of the house. In India, you don't normally wear shoes inside of the house. So for the longest time, my husband would be like, take your shoes off when you come inside the house. But I think now we've all become kind of used to wearing shoes. And so either you have home shoes and outside shoes, or you just end up wearing shoes in the home. So those are things I think we've kind of adapted to, the Western culture and the way of doing things. But it was a huge cultural adjustment moving to the US. It's been more than 20 years now. So I think we've learned to balance both cultures and hold them. But there's always times when one will, take like a higher precedence over the others. And it depends on the kind of people that we're entertaining. If there's an Indian crowd in the house, there's a certain different vibe, and when it's our
Yeah.
American friends whom we love dearly, it's just a different way of doing things.
Mhm.
So you adapt and you learn and you take the best from both the cultures, I think. And I think
Yeah.
that's the best way to live. You take the best from both and you create your own
Yeah.
somewhere
Yeah.
in between the two. Yeah.
That's beautifully said. And I totally agree. That's been one of the biggest blessings of my immigrant journey, is when I learned to do that and see that as a blessing, that I get to
Mm-hmm.
experience both cultures and to be able to kind of make my own mix
Mm-hmm.
of
Yeah.
both. That's
Yeah.
such a blessing. So you mentioned earlier that you were part of an immigrant church for a long
Mm-hmm.
time, and your recent article from your newsletter was also about your time in the immigrant church.
Mm-hmm.
So can you talk more about that? What was your experience like? And for some viewers or listeners who don't know what an immigrant church is, maybe you can tell us, what an immigrant church is and your time there. What do you see as the blessings or the challenges of an immigrant church?
Yeah. So the immigrant church, I would loosely define as just a church with a community of believers who are part of the diaspora. So as Indians, when we live in the US or in the UK or other countries, we are the Indian diaspora. And so the immigrant church is usually built or planted to serve the needs of the diaspora community.
Yeah.
So when we first came to the US, we attended an American church near where we lived in the apartment, and it was great, but it didn't really we didn't really feel like we fit in or we belonged there. So when we met someone at a grocery store who got talking to us and said that, hey, there's an Indian church, in elsewhere. So
was that an Indian grocery store?
yeah, it was an Indian grocery
Yeah.
store. And, we ended up attending this little
Yeah.
immigrant church. It only had about 5 or 6 families, and they were
Mm.
a church plant of a bigger Lutheran church. And
Mm.
so, we had the service inside there, at 11 o'clock in the morning. And it was a really, really small church. And we were there for about a year and a half until we moved to Dallas. And when we moved to Dallas, within the first month, we were determined to find a church. And we really wanted to find an Indian church because we were missing the Indian community so much. And we didn't know anything in Irving because that's where we stayed in Las Colinas, and we didn't know anybody. And so I happened to call the pastor of a church in Houston who told me about a church in Dallas. So got the address back. This was before iPhone days and, before Google Maps and all of that. We drove to this church at 8:45 in the morning, and we got in and we sat down in the last row because they had already begun the service at 9 o'clock and we were late. There was a couple in front of us, and my husband was, I think I know this lady. And I'm like, I don't know, but like she's praying, so don't disturb her. But once the prayer was done, he tapped her on the shoulder and he said hello. And she turned around and she was like, oh my gosh, Joe. So it turned out this lady was his engineering classmate of 4 years back in India. They were in the
Wow.
same class for 4 years. She was really good friends with him and his cousin. And they hadn't seen each other for almost, the whole time between engineering and now. But we ended up at the same church as them, and we just stayed there for 14 years. And it was the community that we were longing for so much because everybody there was an immigrant. The majority of the families were at the same life stage as us. They were, young families with little children, under the age of 3. We were all starting out, and it was a funny joke that we would say that everybody's house had a H1B lamp and a H1B card table because you would get this H1B card table at Sam's Club or Costco with 4 chairs, and everybody had a Walmart H1B lamp, which looked identical because it was all that we could afford. We all lived in a 1-bedroom apartment, and we all shopped at either a Walmart or a Sam's Club or a Costco. So we had the same kind of dishes, the same kind of cars, the same appliances at home. But there was so much of commonality in the fact that we were all going through the same life experiences and on that journey. And so the immigrant church really filled that void. And this was in the early 2000s. So life has definitely changed now. An immigrant from India to the US or any other, I can speak for the Indians, they don't necessarily have the same experiences because the economic status has gone up. People just make more or a better income. And so you can afford a lot more nicer things. So you're not necessarily shopping at a Walmart anymore. So, you could land up and, go to a higher end store or, buy everything that you want from IKEA or from, a furniture store within a week. But this was 20 years ago. We were all finding our way and trying to add things on. And so the church really was our family. It became our community where we could go and we could really be ourselves and bring our whole self to the table. So that's where we were for 14 years until we moved.
What do you think the immigrant church does right? If there are one or two things that other churches can learn from immigrant churches, what would you say that is?
They definitely do community well. You know, I remember within a year of coming to our old Indian church, I was expecting our second child. And I had a lot of complications with that pregnancy. I was on bed rest for a very long time. And I don't even think there was Sign Up Genius at that time. Maybe there was, I don't remember. But between the time that I was on bed rest in my 8th month of pregnancy, and then my father had a heart attack the week that our daughter was born. So my parents couldn't come be with me. So, you know, we were trying to navigate having a newborn and a 4-year-old at the same time. I got fresh food every day. You know, there was somebody who would show up at our door, at our apartment door every day before 9 o'clock in the morning, before they went to work, with fresh Indian food. You know, there was always sambar or rice or rasam, and somebody brought me a container full of batter to make the dosas, because as soon as I could move, I could just make a few for ourselves, you know. And so they would just do community really well, and they still do. If you are sick, or if there's a loss in the family, or there's something that's going wrong, people will show up and they will step up. And it's very organic. It's not very constructed, like, you know, okay, I'm going to bring food on this particular day and here's the menu, which I'm not saying it's bad. I think it's good to have some amount of structure, because I think with organic community, the fridge can get really full of food and then you have too
Yeah.
much of it. But
Yeah.
they will really step up, you know, they will do that. And if you ever need a drive to the airport, you know, if you ever need a lift from the airport, you just need to call somebody and they will show up.
Yeah.
I've never had an experience where someone has said that, oh, we can't take you to the airport right now because we have another commitment.
Yeah.
They will just show up. And so community is something that the immigrant church has done well in the past and still continues to do well. They are willing to inconvenience themselves for the sake of others,
Yeah.
which I love, because you can just pick up the phone and call somebody.
Yeah. Yeah.
You don't have to think twice about it. So that is what they do really well.
Is there anything you think that they struggle with, or they need help, or in any area?
Yeah, I think the area that they would struggle with is because the immigrant church is really built around trying to create the space for family and for connections. I think as a church and as a group of people who love the Lord and who need to grow in the knowledge of God and of the Spirit and in knowledge of scriptures, sometimes they fall short, you know, in discipleship, you know, in trying to teach people how to build that individual walk with God, where people can really grow in their knowledge. Because unless you can't know God apart from the scripture, you know, if you need to know him well, you need to know his word well. And so I think we lack some of the training and the diligent teaching and the biblically based teaching which is needed in order. So people love God, they love God and they know the gospel, but that's not really translated into how they live as spiritually mature Christians. And so very often the faith is very fledgling and very childlike. It doesn't always necessarily grow to a very mature faith, because people are not really digging deep into the word, and like iron sharpens iron, having those Bible-based conversations and, you know, topics about books of the Bible and why this is happening and the history, and going back into for whom this was written, why this was written, and just the theology part of it sometimes is lacking. And so we tend to fail a little bit in that. Not all churches, but from my experience, the majority of the churches struggle with that.
Yeah.
So they find it hard.
Yeah, I understand. And I also feel like maybe our children, first or second generation kids being raised here, might also after a while have a problem connecting with the culture in an immigrant church, because they're being raised in a different culture.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they
Um,
do. I think our kids find that disconnect quite a bit because we raise our children in the way that we know how to raise them as Indians, as Indian parents, and primarily in an Indian community. But then once our children start to go to school, they are out of the house for 8 to 10 hours of a day,
yeah,
and they are in a different school with American teachers, and their culture is different, and that forms them and that shapes them. And so the formation which they have is two different types of formation. And then our children usually have to, they struggle in trying to find that in between and trying to balance that, and that takes them a lifetime to learn, because we as adults
yeah,
are trying to figure that out, but for our kids, especially if they're born here, they struggle even harder to find that sweet spot. And
yeah,
that takes a lifetime of learning and dialogue and conversations with
yeah, yeah,
others. Yeah.
yeah. Not just for them, I think even for us as parents,
Mm-hmm.
there is so much more that we are learning as we parent. And
Yeah.
our struggles are also unique compared to someone who's not an immigrant.
Yeah.
I remember, for example, when my son started going to school, and I think he was in second or third grade, I don't remember, maybe first or second grade. And there was a spelling bee competition, and I just get a note saying he is entered in the competition. And I said, when did this happen? So the teacher said she spoke to him. She asked him if he wants to do it or not. And because he said yes, then she tells us. And I'm thinking, this is backwards. You first ask me. What does the child know, right? But there, even in the schools, the importance is so much on the individual development
Individual.
or independence, that they are
Mm-hmm.
training the child to be so independent, and sometimes does that just does not
It
gel
does.
with
Yeah.
me. I have to step back. And even recently, I think last year, again, the same thing. He told me he finished even taking part in some contest, some math Olympiad or something, and he's waiting for the result. I said, when did this happen? He said, oh, our teacher asked us and we entered this contest. And I'm surprised that they keep parents out of so many
Out of
decisions.
decisions. Yeah.
And I think there has to be a
But here's the
balance.
important question. Did your son win the spelling bee?
Yeah, I mean, he was
There you
second,
go.
but
That's why the teacher put him in the spelling bee.
but she asked him, and I know him. He's kind of lazy, right? So I don't know what she said to him to convince him, but even if he would have said no, we as parents, we know he's good at it. So we would have
Yes.
pushed him to do
Pushed
it,
him to
right?
do it.
That's the Indian parent in me.
That's it.
So, so even if he would have said no, and that's how I think Indian teachers do it, right? They go to the
Yeah.
parents first, and it's up to the parents to
Yes.
convince the child,
Yes.
really.
Yeah. Yes.
So that kind of, I'm sometimes scared how much that independence, where will that lead to,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
but again, I'm still learning. And as a Christian, right, the Bible becomes the main source of all our
Mm.
parenting wisdom. So
Yeah.
let's talk about, how do you balance these cultural differences versus, I'm a Christian mom first.
Mm-hmm.
And do you see like a struggle with all of those thoughts?
Yeah, I think yeah, I mean, we could talk for hours on parenting, just on the topic of parenting. But with being an immigrant parent, I often say this: being a parent is hard, being an immigrant parent is harder. Um, it's really complicated because I have seen the way friends of mine, my cousins, family members parent their children in India. Each time we go back, and kids of the same age, I've seen the way that they parent. It's not that much different from the way that I was raised or my husband was raised. I mean, things have changed because times have changed. There is
Yeah.
more modernity, and of course, the country has changed. But there's a lot of things which are very similar in essence. That hasn't changed. But you come here and then you start to raise a family here. The rule book that you have is gone. And
Yeah.
there is no
Mm-hmm.
blueprint, there is no formula for immigrant parenting, because from the moment that you have a baby, everything is different.
Yeah.
Our son was born in the Middle East, and his infancy was mainly in India. And so a lot of what I did to raise him, from how I, the diapers to the clothes to the foods and everything, was still within a very Indian framework of, Indian doctors, following the advice of my mother, of my mother-in-law, of my
Yeah.
grandmother. That's what I did. But fast forward 4 years, our daughter was born here. And just the way that her infancy was, the things that I did to raise her, I didn't listen to any of my mother's instructions at that time. I followed what my gynecologist and what the pediatrician told me, right? Was whatever they said. If they said no solid food for the first 6 months, there was no solid food for the first 6 months. Whereas with our son, there was solid food in the first 3 months. And I had to answer to my mom and my mother-in-law, like, why aren't you doing any solid food? Well, because the doctor told me not to do it. And then you're dealing with the fact that your mother is upset with you because you're listening to these modern doctors in the US because you think that they know it all, whereas, we have years of experience. So from that infancy stage through preschool, through kindergarten, through everything that you do, everything is different, and you adapt the way that you parent to the culture that you're living in. And that's really hard, because if your spouse and you don't agree on some of those things, there's constant tension. And so my husband and I have had a lot of struggles in that, because his parenting style is different from mine. And added to the fact that I was more willing to adapt to some of the cultural things, while he was like, we're not going to adapt to all of that. We're going to do it the way that we know. And so that has caused some amount of strife and tension in the teenage years, especially for our kids. And so it's caused us to turn a lot more to God, and to depend on him, and to really trust in God's wisdom, and find a formula that works for our family. So the
Yeah.
formula that
Mm-hmm.
works for the Rajadurai family is
Excuse me.
not what will work for your family. You have
Yeah.
to find
Mm-hmm.
that there's elements in it which we can all adapt, but I think we each have to find something that works for us. And I think what I would say is, really, the one thing that we have learned is, if I had to say something to younger immigrant families, is really talk to your kids. Really spend time in listening to your children and understanding what they go through in the culture outside of the home, because we have no idea of the tension and the stresses and the challenges that they
Yeah.
face in
Mm-hmm.
middle school, high school. The pressure of the outside culture is immense.
Yeah.
Don't be like an ostrich with its head in the ground.
Yeah.
Be aware of pop
Yeah.
culture and what they go through, so that you can listen to them and have
Yeah.
that dialogue. So
Yeah.
talking to our kids is super important.
That's such a helpful tip, especially because I feel like I don't know what it is like to grow up here
Mm-hmm.
as a minority. I went to schools in India where, I was like everyone else. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't know the stress that is caused by being the only Indian kid in church, or
Mm-hmm.
in school, or in class, or things like that, or knowing very well, being aware that culturally you're different, that your skin color is different. So
Yeah.
I always try to be aware of that, put myself in my son's shoes, because his experience is just so drastically different from
Yeah.
my childhood experience. And so,
Yeah.
like you said, that's where God's wisdom comes in,
Mm-hmm.
right? And my prayer is also to give my son a strong foundation in scripture, so that his identity is centered around God. And
Mm-hmm.
even though he's got this unique cultural identity, first
Yeah.
and foremost, he sees himself as a child of God.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. It is hard for our kids. I think we have to find a way to engage them. And I'm also aware that because our children are older, that as our kids grow up here, they form their own unique diaspora culture, which is a blend of two or three. They kind of bring that to the table, and it's just interesting because we have a son who's 20, and so his friends are that age and older, so they're young adults. So it's been really interesting for us to kind of see how they're creating their own diaspora, the culture, and blending the best of being Indian and being American into that. And so there's a beauty in that. And so as the future generations grow, it's probably going to change. And so
Yeah.
So a lot of immigrant parenting, like all parenting, is done on our knees, I think. Just praying and just trusting God for wisdom.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Sherene, for talking with us. I felt like I could go on talking, with you.
We
You
could
have
talk
so
for
much
hours, yes.
wisdom, yeah, to share. And tell us, where can our listeners or viewers find you or contact you? Is it through your website?
Yeah, you can contact me on the website. I'm also on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. Yeah, so on all the socials, trying to connect with people. So I'm always happy to engage with people who just want to ping me. Yeah.
Okay.
So
So I'll put
thank you
your
so much for
website.
having me.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. This has been a pleasure and a blessing. And I will put a link to your website in the show notes. But thank you so much for talking with us.
Thank you so much, Mabel.